You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. September 2012 marks the first global World Alzheimer's Month, an international campaign to raise awareness and challenge the stigma attached to dementia. In 2010, it was estimated that 36 million people worldwide were living with the illness. The figure is expected to rise to 66 million by 2030. Currently in the UK, up to 820,000 people live with dementia. Initial signs of the illness, which is caused by diseases of the brain, may include short-term memory loss that affects everyday life, problems with thinking or reasoning, or unexplained anxiety or depression. With me in the studio to discuss dementia is Beth Britton, a freelance writer, blogger and dementia campaigner after her father lived with vascular dementia for around the last 19 years of his life. Professor Paul Francis of Neurochemistry and Director Brains for Dementia Research at King's College London University. And Janet Crampton, an independent health and social care consultant. And joining our discussion on the telephone is Leon Smith, Chief Executive of Nightingale, a partly publicly funded residential care home that specialises in dementia. Now, in March, Prime Minister David Cameron said he wanted to see the UK become a world leader in the field of Alzheimer's research and promised the research budget would be doubled to £66 million by 2015. However, the world's leading pharmaceutical companies are downgrading the search for new treatment for Alzheimer's disease after the failure of a series of high-profile drugs trials. Firstly, what needs to be done to beat Alzheimer's? I'll start with you first, Professor Francis.
Dementia is a global term. Within that, there are various different illnesses, if you correctly pointed out. And we think of vascular dementia, we think of Alzheimer's disease. They may actually have different ways in which we need to tackle them. Alzheimer's disease has particular problems. Vascular dementia is much more driven by the sort of things which might affect your heart. So if we're going to cure dementia, it may be we have to cure dementias. And we need to think about what each of them might be doing to the brain and how we might correct that.
How worried are you at the recent failures of the two experimental research drugs into beating Alzheimer's?
It's clearly worrying that there's been this sort of problem. I think maybe we had slightly the wrong target, or certainly the wrong target at the wrong time. I think the drugs which have been trialled recently and had very modest or negative results, they may work at a different stage of Alzheimer's disease. They probably won't work in vascular dementia. So what we need is a more pragmatic approach where we try and tackle the underlying cause, maybe trying to identify people much earlier before we start a treatment. But the other aspect is that we need to treat people with dementia currently. We do have some drugs which are available in the UK which help and relieve some symptoms. A greater effort needs to be made to find newer drugs which will improve both cognitive function, thinking, memory and so on, but also changes in behaviour. This is a very, very important area. And whilst pharmaceutical companies may be withdrawing from some of these disease-modifying, these big drug trials, they may still be willing to entertain targeting symptoms of dementia.
Beth, I'd like to move to you now and ask you the same question, what you think needs to be done to beat Alzheimer's. I know your father had vascular dementia.
Yes, he did. He had it for 19 years. He went about 10 years without a diagnosis and then spent the last 9 years of his life in 3 different care homes. My dad never really had much in the way of drug treatments. Some of the drugs that are given now, particularly for Alzheimer's, weren't around then and they wouldn't have been suitable for my father anyway. The only thing in terms of pharmaceuticals that we had much experience of really was the use of antipsychotics, which we were very against. And there is a big drive now to actually reduce the use of antipsychotics in dementia treatment and move particularly towards more therapeutic avenues. And obviously my dad went a long time without a diagnosis, and I think if people are diagnosed earlier, then obviously they can make a better plan for their future.
I rather suspect that dementia is now where cancer and stroke was a few years ago, and that actually there is a much bigger focus now. It helped enormously that the Prime Minister personally challenged us all to find solutions for living better with dementia. May I just put into context what my particular interest is, because I've just completed some research for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation on how to make York a more dementia-friendly city. And this is part of their Dementia and Society campaign. And I would actually say that you're absolutely right, Juliet, that we do need strong leadership around this. And of course it helps if that leadership also unlocks some resources to devote to research or to responses from the community. But actually it is a community problem. Our research very clearly indicates that although the kind of response that health and social care give to people with dementia and to their families and their carers, actually people want to continue to live in the community as they always have done for as long as it's possible. So the whole focus on an early diagnosis, whilst that's important, it is an early diagnosis only in so much that they can continue to live the kind of lives they want. And one of the things that I would like to say is that maybe globally, I don't know, but certainly in the UK, we've tended to let health own dementia. And there has been a push through the National Dementia Strategy that should be widened out, not just about health, it's about social care, and it's about community services. And it is in the community where people live, and that's where the response to their dementia. You mentioned stigma earlier, and I think that one of the ways that we can make life much better for people with dementia and those who care for them is to begin eroding the stigmas associated with it.
Leon Smith from Nightingale, a partly publicly funded residential care home. What do you think? Is it the stigma that needs to be tackled first, or the funding for the research, or obviously all at the same time?
Well, I think it's a bit of everything. There can be no question that the global generic term dementia is one that is still very stigmatized, in much the same way as cancer was some years ago, and in much the same way that AIDS was some years ago. And of course, the real problem with this is that so many people simply don't understand dementia. They don't know what it is, and they find it, understandably, they find it very, very frightening. So I think there's a need for the government and for the National Health Service to invest not only in drug research and in pharmacological solutions, but also in information and education as well. I run a very large care home which accommodates about 200 people, and I would say that probably about 80% of the people living in my home have got a dementia at some level, be it diagnosed or not diagnosed. The problem is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. To me, one of the frustrations is that we have known for a very long time that with longevity come increased levels of dementia, yet somehow or the other it seems to have crept up on us, and we seem to be surprised by that. So action is needed now in regard to dementia, in the same way that action is needed now generally in relation to our care and funding of older people.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Juliet Spare, where we're talking about dementia. Joining me on the telephone is Leon Smith, Chief Executive of Nightingale, a residential care home. Paul Francis, Professor of Neurochemistry and Director, Brains for Dementia Research at King's College London. Beth Britton, a freelance writer, blogger and dementia campaigner. And Janet Crumpton, an independent health and social care consultant. Professor Francis, you're obviously giving a picture of what it could look like in 2030 with the estimated numbers of people suffering from it. Is it that disease has a fashion? It's almost where stroke awareness was, where cancer awareness was a few years ago. Do we need to make Alzheimer's a common word in the home?
I think there is a growing awareness, partly because we are getting better at identifying people as having dementia as opposed to just becoming rather old. There is an issue, firstly, just to pick up something that was discussed a little bit earlier, in terms of early diagnosis. There are two reasons for early diagnosis. One, which we sort of understand, which is useful in the context of society, is people have the capacity early in dementia to say what happens to them. So actually getting a diagnosis earlier and understanding what your journey through dementia may be can be very helpful to people because they can make decisions about their life. But there's a second reason, which is about treatment. We talked about the two drugs that had failed recently and the fact that perhaps it might be that we'd given them too late. It may be that if we'd given those drugs 10 years before, they might have worked. But that will require a huge effort in terms of understanding and research to get back to that point and say in 10 years' time, if we do nothing, you will develop Alzheimer's disease. So society needs to understand these different things, that's true, but it's mostly because we are better at identifying dementia in its various forms.
Janet Crampton.
Well, I'd like to come in on that because, of course, you're absolutely right, Paul, but I'm just going to introduce a caveat to early diagnosis because although it is important, and of course there is a national campaign to promote early diagnosis, for a start that diagnosis has to be given empathetically. And there's too much evidence that it's presented as a take it or leave it, it's a function of old age, there's nothing can be done. And actually sometimes done quite dismissively and very cruelly and leaves people fairly abandoned and without hope. So there's that element to it. But the other important thing about early diagnosis, whilst it can of course be very helpful, it's only really helpful if there's a whole raft of services available in the community to support people. And my contention is, and one of the outcomes of my research has been that actually, although the statutory agencies have known for a very long time that there's been this great bulge in the older population, not enough has been done to prepare for it. And so the early diagnosis, given well and supported by routes to other support, is the scenario that we should be aiming for.
Beth, do you wish your father had been diagnosed earlier?
Oh, absolutely, I do, yes. I mean, actually, very early on, when my dad first started showing some symptoms, a lady who knew my parents said to my mother, should I think that Ray has the beginnings of Alzheimer's? And I remember Mum coming home, I would have been about 12 years old at the time, and she said this to myself and my siblings, and we all sort of looked at each other and we were like, Alzheimer's, what's that? You know, he can't possibly have that, he's only in his 60s. And it would be many, many years later that he would have a diagnosis. Obviously, it wasn't Alzheimer's, it was vascular dementia, but it was still obviously within the dementia spectrum. And the only reason my father actually ended up with a diagnosis, despite the fact that his GP, social services and a consultant psychiatrist all knew about Dad's dementia, he didn't actually get one until we found him collapsed at home. We had to call an ambulance, he'd been on the floor all night, he was very cold. He was taken to hospital, he'd had a larger stroke, and it was once he began to recover from that the clinical staff in the hospital then realised the situation that Dad was in, and he was moved to an elderly mentally infirm ward, during which time we then met the same psychiatrist who'd been out to see my father all those months previously, had diagnosed his dementia and claimed at that time that there was nothing he could do until a crisis point occurred. That crisis point for my dad was obviously being collapsed on the floor. He could have died of hypothermia. So, yes, I wish we had known a lot earlier, a concrete diagnosis. But I absolutely agree with Janet. You know, it is an issue of support. Through the work I'm doing now, I hear from so many people who actually do have a diagnosis and have absolutely no support whatsoever. Their situation is very much that they perhaps went to their GP with some symptoms, reluctantly probably went to their GP with some symptoms. They were given a commonly dismissive diagnosis and told to basically go away and get on with it. And they're left to try and find the avenues of support for themselves, obviously through some of the charities are doing some great work. But, you know, people do feel very alone still, and I think that's a very big gap in dementia support at the moment.
Leon, you have obviously families and people suffering with dementia in your residential care home. What do you see as the saddest episode?
Gosh, that's a difficult question. I think one of the great problems is that many people believe that once somebody has dementia or once there has been a diagnosis of dementia, that somehow or the other that is the end of life, that life cannot go on beyond that. And that, of course, is very, very distressing for families. It's very distressing for families who come to visit a parent or a sibling and they're not even recognized. To us, the key is making sure that we see the person behind the dementia and not just the dementia. So it's person first, dementia second. We at Nightingale House are working very closely with the dementia group at Bradford University, who have done a lot of research into care of older people with dementia, and we're working very closely with them at Nightingale House. And we now understand the importance of offering quality, person-centered care, reacting to the needs, the preferences, and the choices of the older person with dementia, rather than a one-size-fits-all regime. And just also in answer to your question, one of the great difficulties that many people have with a parent who may have dementia at any level is knowing how to visit them in the care home. It's very difficult. You come to see your mother or your father, they may barely recognize you, they may have very, very little recollection of what's going on around them. But there are all sorts of helpful tips which can be given on how to make the whole experience easier and more pleasurable, both for the visitor and for the resident.
So you talk about that being in the residential home, and you, Janet, sort of want to replicate that within the community, and your work in York is to make York a leader in the UK as to how a city copes with an ageing population.
Well, we'd like to think it's a leader, but it's a contended title, I think, because there are other communities that are also striving to become, communities and organisations striving to become more dementia-friendly. But one of the recommendations we make in our report is that there should be more training in dementia awareness for the non-care sector, and that could easily include families. So picking up on Leon's point, a lot of families would probably want to know more in order to engage better with their relative, in the same way that people in the community going around, in their normal everyday jobs, they want to be able to provide a good service, they want to deal with their customers in an empathetic and friendly way, and it helps if people have some of the fear factor removed from dementia. We identify instances where sometimes the kind of target-driven roles that till operators, for instance, in supermarkets to get people through the the checkouts very quickly, stumbles when someone is confused or needs a little more time and patience, and we say that that's an employer's responsibility to give that person the skill to deal with that situation, but also allow them the opportunity to suspend that target maybe for that person for that moment.
Our feeling really was that we had no information at all when we started on Dad's dementia journey, and frankly we learned as we went along, day by day, week by week, month by month. What I would say is that I never found it difficult to visit him, although he was in a care home for the last 9 years. That wasn't our choice. The hospital staff felt that was the best place for him to deal with the behaviour that he was exhibiting at the time. But we were very hands-on as a family, and we just got on with it. I think an awful lot of people, they do see a diagnosis as the end of the world. They put a parent into a care home, they perhaps feel very guilty about that. And they struggle to cope. My attitude was be positive, try and make the best of every day, breathe as much quality of life into my father's dementia journey. And I think on many occasions, particularly when he had, sort of some fairly serious infections and he was hospitalised, I think it was the love and the dedication of his family that kind of gave him the will to go on, really.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Juliet Spare, and talking about dementia today is Beth Britton, a freelance writer, blogger and dementia campaigner, Professor Paul Francis, Professor of Neurochemistry and Director Brains for Dementia Research at King's College London, Paul Francis, Janet Crampton, an independent health and social care consultant. And on the telephone, Leon Smith, Chief Executive of Nightingale, a partly publicly funded residential care home specialising in dementia. We talk about parents obviously going into care, but with a few articles I've read recently, the diagnosis of early onset dementia, you're not necessarily dealing with a parent, you're dealing with a loved one, a person you may have married, who you now see suffering from an illness which has other effects such as depression and not wanting to accept what's going on. How much, Professor Francis, do we know about early onset dementia, and is there enough research going into it? And has actually David Cameron allocated money for that alongside, or is that under the umbrella of Alzheimer's?
Early onset dementia is particularly difficult, as you mentioned, because we're comparing somebody who might be in their 40s or 50s with other people who don't have dementia in their 40s and 50s. The typical age of having dementia is perhaps in the 70s or 80s. And to some extent, we make a little more allowance for that. In terms of should we treat them separately, only in the sense that research can help us, because a lot of the very early onset cases of dementia have a truly genetic origin. They're carried in families. So they tell us and help us a lot in understanding the disease, which may be more generalizable to the older population. You also mentioned symptoms, particular symptoms. You mentioned depression, apathy, denial, aggressive behavior, sometimes psychosis, nighttime, wandering around at night. We often think of dementia simply in terms of the ability to remember somebody, to locate yourself in time and space. These are difficult symptoms, but actually if you look at the reports, what most people find, or carers find difficult, is help with activities of daily living, such as bathing, eating, getting dressed. But also the next one, before we get to cognition or memory or anything like that, is these behaviours. People who look after people with dementia have a huge difficulty with some of these challenging behaviours, and a great effort needs to be made to deal with these, to find ways of dealing with them within a non-pharmacological way, but also we need to find new pharmacology approaches where those don't work or they persist for too long.
Janet Crampton.
I think you've identified a big area of concern as well, and that's for the relatives of people who are given a diagnosis relatively early in their lives, because, someone can live with dementia for a very long time, and that imposes a huge toll upon the family, close friends, neighbours, the local community. And it really is vitally important that that's recognised, because that needs investing in. In my experience, and I'm a carer myself, my mother has dementia, I know that most relatives would want to continue to be as supportive as possible for as long as possible, whilst it's safe and appropriate to do so. But they get worn out. The attrition of daily life is a huge challenge to people. And without adequate support, that's really very difficult. And that support can be something very simple, like the right kind of information at the right time. But it can also be very practical support about giving carers real respite so that they actually can have their batteries recharged. But I've met people who, they're torn between the desire to continue to care for their relative and the fact that actually they're dealing with their personal disappointment that their futures have been changed too. So, for instance, in the case of someone looking after a spouse, this is maybe not the old age and the retirement that they'd expected. They know that they have to adjust. It just helps enormously if they're given the right kind of support to do that.
Beth, you are a freelance writer and blogger. I'm interested in how your blog has helped you, and how maybe in the 21st century digital revolution we might be able to put an end to the loneliness, that people may be able to find an outlet online and then link and find other people experiencing the same situation.
Yeah, I started my D for Dementia blog on the 20th of May this year. My dad actually passed away in April, so it wasn't very long afterwards. I'd actually had my life on hold for years during my dad's dementia, so, I didn't really have a career. My life was focused on my dad, so I wanted really for his experiences to not be in vain. That's why I started the blog, and I've found through the feedback that I've had that it's been a massive support to people that have discovered it. It's had thousands and thousands of hits, even in a relatively short space of time. I also use social media quite a lot, Twitter and Facebook, in order to sort of connect with people and support them. And, as a result, I've heard some incredibly sad stories about things that people are going through with dementia at the moment. It kind of makes me think maybe things haven't changed as much as I would like them to, and we do actually still have quite a long way to go. But I think for people that have access to computers and the internet, it can be a massive source of comfort. I try and post very realistic blogs about, what we went through. I've covered things like swallowing difficulties. I even wrote about my dad's end-of-life care, just to give people as much information as possible. Maybe they find out the things from me that nobody else actually wants to tell them.
One other area which I think is very, very important is that a lot of work and research has been done into the effect of the built environment upon clients or residents living with dementia. We ourselves have done an enormous amount of research, and we have now created a purpose-built dementia wing, which has taken on board most of the findings. And everything is important. The design, the layout of the building, having routes that people can wander through, not having any thresholds, not having any dead ends, having appropriate colour schemes, lighting, etc. All of these things, together with the actual physical hands-on care, can contribute enormously to the quality of life of those living with dementia in our home.
Well, I'd just like to support what Leon is saying about place. But of course, actually, it starts outside a care home or even outside someone else's home, because for people trying to carry on their normal lives as long as possible, being able to find their way around in their local landscape, understanding the signage, being able to use public transport, getting from A to B, trying to carry on with the connections in their local community, comes very, very high on the list of things that people want to be able to continue to do.
Professor Francis, finally, David Cameron wants the UK to become a world leader in the field of research. Is this possible?
It certainly is possible. We do have the people and the capabilities within the UK. One of the drugs that we use routinely now was essentially based on work which was discovered here 30 years ago now. So, clearly there is a heritage of working in dementia to find new treatments. We have a very committed scientific community. Unfortunately, we have had companies which have pulled out of neuroscience in the UK, neuroscience being the area of science which is relevant to this. And what we can do to encourage them back, to build partnerships between science in universities, science in pharmaceutical companies, clinical workers, but also very much to take account of the environment, the dementia journey, what it is to begin with, what are the things that people find most difficult to cope with, and perhaps to target those as best we can.
I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me, Juliet Spare, on the Voice of Russia here in London. Beth Britton, a freelance writer, blogger and dementia campaigner. Professor of Neurochemistry and Director, Brains for Dementia Research at King's College London, Paul Francis. Leon Smith, Chief Executive of a residential care home specialising in dementia. And Janet Crumpton, an independent health and social care consultant. Problems with thinking or reasoning or unexplained anxiety or depression. With me in the studio to discuss dementia is Beth Britton, a freelance writer, blogger and dementia campaigner after her father lived with vascular dementia for around the last 19 years of his life. Professor Paul Francis of Neurochemistry and Director Brains for Dementia Research at King's College London University. And Janet Crampton, an independent health and social care consultant. And joining our discussion on the telephone is Leon Smith, Chief Executive of Nightingale, a partly publicly funded residential care home that specialises in dementia. Now, in March, Prime Minister David Cameron said he wanted to see the UK become a world leader in the field of Alzheimer's research and promised the research budget would be doubled to £66 million by 2015. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. September 2012 marks the first global World Alzheimer's Month, an international campaign to raise awareness and challenge the stigma attached to dementia. In 2010, it was estimated that 36 million people worldwide were living with the illness. The figure is expected to rise to 66 million by 2030. Currently in the UK, up to 820,000 people live with dementia. Initial signs of the illness, which is caused by diseases of the brain, may include short-term memory loss that affects everyday life. Because of the two experimental research drugs into beating Alzheimer's.
It's clearly worrying that there's been this sort of problem. I think maybe we had slightly the wrong target, or certainly the wrong target at the wrong time. I think the drugs which have been trialled recently and had very modest or negative results, they may work at a different stage of Alzheimer's disease. They probably won't work in vascular dementia. So what we need is a more pragmatic approach where we try and tackle the underlying cause, maybe trying to identify people much earlier before we start a treatment. But the other aspect is that we need to treat people with dementia currently. We do have some drugs which are available in the UK which help and relieve some symptoms. A greater effort needs to be made to find newer drugs which will improve.
However, the world's leading pharmaceutical companies are downgrading the search for new treatment for Alzheimer's disease after the failure of a series of high-profile drugs trials. Firstly, what needs to be done to beat Alzheimer's? I'll start with you first, Professor Francis.
Dementia is a global term. Within that, there are various different illnesses, if you correctly pointed out. And we think of vascular dementia, we think of Alzheimer's disease. They may actually have different ways in which we need to tackle them. Alzheimer's disease has particular problems. Vascular dementia is much more driven by the sort of things which might affect your heart. So if we're going to cure dementia, it may be we have to cure dementias. And we need to think about what each of them might be doing to the brain and how we might correct that.
How worried are you at the recent failure?
Improve both cognitive function, thinking, memory and so on, but also changes in behaviour. This is a very, very important area. And whilst pharmaceutical companies may be withdrawing from some of these disease-modifying, these big drug trials, they may still be willing to entertain targeting symptoms of dementia.
Beth, I'd like to move to you now and ask you the same question, what you think needs to be done to beat Alzheimer's. I know your father had vascular dementia.
Yes, he did. He had it for 19 years. He went about 10 years without a diagnosis and then spent the last 9 years of his life in 3 different care homes. My dad never really had much in the way of drug treatments. Some of the drugs that are given now, particularly for Alzheimer's, weren't around then and they wouldn't have been suitable for my father anyway. The only thing in terms of pharmaceutical